Okay, Sunday afternoon. See you on the other side podcast, live podcast taping. This is episode 296. And Wendy and I are excited to be joined by Matthew Kresal, all the way from Huntsville, Alabama, to talk to us about the paranormal inspirations behind the 1990s TV series, Gone But Not Forgotten, Dark Skies. How you doing
Welcome.
today? Yeah, how you doing today, Matthew? Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And I'm excited to be talking to somebody from Huntsville because I have a special place in my heart for Huntsville because I went to space camp when I was a kid. And
it is a cool place. I'm from here, but I have never gotten to attend, sadly. It is on my bucket list.
But that park, the Space and Rocket Center, is amazing. An amazing place to visit, even if you don't go to camp. So.
Oh, yes. It is. It's one of my homes away from home. Somehow, between people coming here and everything else, I'm there at least once a year.
Oh, that's great. Excellent.
Very cool. Wendy, I forgot you went to space camp. And wait, this is, I think, now, my favorite story about your space camp, though, is that when you guys finally got to the test mission,
oh no,
you didn't make it to the moon, did you?
What?
Well, we weren't going to the moon. I actually was on the space lab.
Oh,
So
okay.
I was one of the lucky ones that got to go on the mission, and I wasn't, like, my sister was stuck on ground control. And but yeah, unfortunately I misread the script and I ended up like opening the hatch to the vacuum of space, which in reality would have killed the entire crew. It would have been a very bad scene, but they were kind enough to kind of look the other way and let me do a little undo on that so we could continue our mission. So
right.
Yeah.
But the thing is,
my proudest moment.
But the funny thing is, I mean, that's why they do these kind of simulations and stuff like that. Like, mistakes are bound to happen, right? Because you don't want to have that happen like in the atmosphere. Where you want it to happen is at space camp.
Right. I think it's one of the astronauts who said, talking about training one time, that nobody's ever been killed in a simulator.
Right.
So,
Let's hope not, especially at camp, right?
All right.
well, there was this one time at space camp.
Right.
Right. I shoved a rocket booster in my. Okay.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
Oh, boy.
so Matt, I want to know. First of all, we're talking about Dark Skies, and you mentioned before it's part of the Silver Archive. So can you describe a
Yes.
little bit what the Silver Archive is?
Certainly. The Silver Archive is from Obverse Books. It's actually a spin-off of a Doctor Who-centric range they have called the Black Archive, which, if for people who are fans of Doctor Who, may remember that the Black Archive is where UNIT, an organization on the show, stores all of this alien tech and artifacts and whatnot which have come to Earth. And they use the name for a range of books looking at sort of doing critical analysis and reviews of various Doctor Who stories. And that range had been going for a couple of years and was very successful. And Stuart Douglas, who runs Obverse, got the idea he wanted to expand into what the Brits like to call cult TV properties. So things like Sapphire and Steel, The Prisoner, Dark Skies even. So that's very much what the Silver Archive is looking at the sometimes overlooked pieces of cult TV and saying, let's examine them, let's look at them, what can we say about them? And that was very much what I wanted to do well, because it is a show that takes a lot of elements of real ufology and American history and sort of bashes them all together into a science fiction context. And it was one of those shows where, it's like all of my interests all in one place. If somebody made a TV show and did a checklist, all of that would be all of my stuff. So it was like, I want to write a book about this. And I was lucky enough that Obverse was willing to let me do it.
That's really
Awesome.
cool. If people do not quite remember Dark Skies, and I can't blame them because it only lasted a season. And I mean, but I remember it coming out, and this is right after this is like 1996. Okay, so this, if you guys think about the X-Files launches in 1993, and obviously we've talked about the X-Files in this show at length because we're huge fans, and X-Files had a bunch of copycat shows coming in afterwards because all of a sudden the network saw that science fiction could be profitable. And so all of these different kind of science fiction shows launched right after it. There was a great X-Files type show out of Canada with Matt Frewer, Max Headroom, that was hosted by Dan Aykroyd, would come in there.
Yeah,
like
Sci-Factor, I think it was.
Chronicles of the Paranormal. I was like,
Nice.
those shows would be awesome. It'd be on like late syndicated Baywatch. Baywatch, right? The show that's all about jiggles and butts and stuff like that. Baywatch ends up having its own paranormal show called Baywatch Nights. So even David Hasselhoff is getting in on the X-Files act. And Dark Skies kind of gets lumped into that X-Files copycat thing. I mean, they do have a male-female protagonist. That's nothing new. You have the male-female, I guess it's not as much as the X-Files will they or won't they kind of sexual tension and drama. But it has that same kind of male-female protagonist, and it's set up against the very, very 1990s. I mean, I guess as far it was different in the culture war in the 1990s that more people, like, it was the different sides that were interested in government conspiracies. Now it seems to have kind of flipped, where the conservatives are government conspiracies and the liberals are against it. And in the 1990s, it seemed the other way around. But either way, it was feeding on that, like all the movies, Enemy of the State, were this idea that the government's going to kill you, or it's, it was had it in for you. And Dark Skies kind of fed into that X-Files style thing. So give us a little bit of, like, it lasted one season. How many episodes? When you were doing the research, did you kind of find out like how it got picked up and what happened to it?
I did. It did last only the one season. And one of the really interesting things I discovered as part of my research was that there was this big 5-year plan for what they were going to do with it in terms of where the show was going to go, and actually moving forward starting in the 1960s, but moving forward all the way up to the present day, so that by the time you got to season 5, airing in 99-2000, the show would have been taking place in 99-2000. But it lasted 19 episodes altogether. Technically 20, because there's actually 2 different versions of the pilot, The Awakening, which is a fun story in its own right. So there's 19 episodes, 18 of which are about 45 minutes long. You've got the 90-minute pilot, which when it was shown on Sci-Fi Channel in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is where I first saw it, was sort of broken up in 2, so you did have a 2-parter there. And that first pilot movie, because it was so standalone, actually ended up going into syndication as well. It would occasionally pop up on movie channels as its own separate movie called Dark Skies.
And what's cool about that too is, so the pilot, like I remember watching it when it came out, and in college I had a hard time keeping up with much TV or whatever. But when it came out, I remember making sure to watch the pilot because it was directed by Tobe Hooper. And we talked about Tobe Hooper in the podcast before. We did a necrolog for him after he passed, because a lot of his movies have paranormal connections. The Poltergeist Curse. He also directed some shows based on like real life paranormal things, like the haunted Toys R Us in California and stuff. And so it was really cool that this movie director, who had done the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Poltergeist, Life Force, that he came and would do a TV show based on the UFO kind of phenomenon. So there's a cool connection there where you not only have, first of all, they give it a 2-hour pilot, which means that NBC, it was an NBC show, right? Was it CBS?
It was NBC.
It was an NBC show that they were willing to put some money behind the pilot for 2 hours. And second of all, that they were willing to put the money behind a director with a lot of genre cred. Like Tobe Hooper comes in, you're like, okay, well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, Bryce Zabel and Brent Friedman, who created the show, have said in interviews over the years, and it's on the DVD set from Shout Factory that came out about 10 years ago as well, that they really lucked out in getting Tobe Hooper to do it, because there was at least one other director whose name I don't have, because Bryce wouldn't give it to me, that they did approach, and who basically went, I kind of like your script, but I want to ditch the entire back half of it, and I want to rewrite the front half of it. And so in many So they kind of were like, thanks, but no thanks. And they really lucked out with Tobe Hooper doing it and it's there in both versions of The Awakening, which is the pilot, just how well directed that it is and how much atmosphere he's able to bring to to some of the sequences in it. There's the abduction sequence about midway through, for example, which is really atmospheric, and it's still a very sinister take on the idea. And just the way that it's presented. And he, as I said, the fact that he directed things like Poltergeist, for example, really makes it clear how much he was able to, do that. And they really lucked out, I think, with the pilot with getting him involved with it.
Well, right away in the pilot, too, it brings out a couple of real life UFO lore type of things.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, number one, it talks about Project Blue Book. And we've talked about the History Channel Project Blue Book on the show before. J. Allen Hynek, who is a fictional version of J. Allen Hynek, played by Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, who's a great actor.
Right.
Mayor Carcetti from The Wire. I mean, he's a great actor. But J. Allen Hynek, his Center for UFO Studies was in Chicago, and so they had a bunch of Project Blue Book, they premiered the first and second season, I think, in Chicago for people to go to. And while it can be very entertaining television, as a fictional thing, the relationship between Littlefinger J. Allen Hynek and actual J. Allen Hynek isn't very close. And so, but I mean, what I thought about, but this is today. And we're going back to 25 years ago or 24 years ago when it debuted, nobody had kind of tried to take all of the classic UFO cases and put them all together. Like the X-Files danced around it, but it definitely created its own kind of mythology. The X-Files was its own. And these guys from Dark Skies were trying to create their own lore. I mean, we're trying to create the fictional story based on the UFO lore that was already existing and kind of unify it and bring it together. When you were working on the book, you had a chance to talk to the creators.
Yes.
And did they talk about what inspired them in the first place? Were they not getting enough from the X-Files? Were they thinking the X-Files weren't using all of this classic stuff? Or what made them want to start creating a period piece, which is extra money because you got to rent the cars and stuff like that.
So many great cars.
Right. And you have to when you do an exterior, you have to sit there and change Main Street and the whole thing when you do it. So, what inspired them to go back, try to grab UFO lore? Were they just big UFO nuts and alien nuts? Did any of them have an encounter?
I don't think either one of them had an encounter, but there definitely had been stuff in both of their lives that really kind of influenced it. Brent Friedman talked about when he was in his late teens, his next door neighbor was a high-ranking official in the Reagan administration. And very early on after they were appointed to government, he was paid Brent to drive the family cars across country from California to D.C. So he told me the story. They got there one night. There's a big dinner and party, and him and this high-ranking official, this family friend, are out on the balcony. And sort of just having a conversation, shooting the breeze, about, where you're going to go to college, what's your plans afterwards, etc. And Brent asked him about what he was doing in government. And the official told him he couldn't really answer the question, but there was something he could tell him that he thought would excite him, which was that aliens were here, they were real, and he had seen them.
What? Wait, hold on a second. We have to. That's the coolest story ever.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yes. And they had a whole conversation standing out on this balcony where Brent was asking all the obvious questions about, well, why hasn't this been revealed? And one of the things that the official told him was that, well, the truth is out there. You can go into any bookstore and you can pick up a book, but it's surrounded by a lot of disinformation and a lot of misinformation. And Brent also asked the question, which is, is anybody ever going to come out and reveal it? And what the official told him in so many words was that essentially, maybe in your lifetime, but expected that it would be more like sort of the frog and water effect, that there would just be a sort of accumulation of information.
Wait, until... I don't know what the frog and water effect is, so you got to help me out with that.
Yes, so it's the idea if you put a frog in a thing of water and you slowly boil it, the frog is not going to react because it's just going to gradually get there.
So as opposed to tossing it into a boiling pot.
Exactly.
Okay, I've told that same kind of story about lobsters.
Yes.
So it's like that. The lobster's in the boiling water or whatever, and then it's by the time it realizes that it's getting hot, it's already about to get some butter on it.
Yes.
But lobsters can't jump out like a frog can.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but they can claw you.
They can pinch their way out.
Yeah, they can pinch it a little bit.
But there would sort of be an accumulation of information until it would just kind of be a fact of life kind of thing, was very much the impression that he got. And the other thing that he told Brent was that, the fact of the matter is that the government didn't really know anything more than the rest of us did, to be honest, even with what they apparently had, which at least would assume there would be alien bodies. As Brent said, years later, his wife was actually working on Lois and Clark, the early 90s Superman series. And the supervising producer and writer... I
still have a crush on Terry Hatcher, by the way.
She was a bloody good Lois Lane.
Yes, great Lois Lane.
But one of the supervisor producers and writers for that first season of Lois and Clark was Bryce Zabel. And Bryce had a lifelong interest in the UFO subject. He grew up not far from McMackinville in Oregon, the famous 1950 UFOs photos taken there. So he grew up just down the street from there and had a lot of an interest in it. And I believe, if memory serves, that Brent's wife was his assistant. So eventually they got together, and the two of them, between their sort of mutual interest, started working on a project. And Bryce, as well, had already written a UFO movie, in effect. There's a movie called Official Denial. It was the first original movie made by the Sci-Fi Channel in 1993. Was written by Bryce.
Wow, he was the first sci-fi original. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I've seen a lot of sci-fi originals.
Yeah.
The script for it is quite interesting. There's a lot of fascinating ideas in there, and in many respects, it feels like a first draft for Dark Skies. The problem is Bryce said, the tragedy of his life is that instead of selling it to a studio who was going to spend money on it, it got sold to the Sci-Fi Channel, who spent $2 million on it. And the little gray alien is a 12-year-old ballerina in a leotard with a rubber mask.
Oh,
no. So I kind of get the impression that Bryce wasn't really happy with how Official Denial had ended up. And the two of them, between their interests, just kind of put the thing together. And I think that was, as Bryce also said in an interview with Robbie Graham in Silver Screen Saucers, that basically everything they knew about ufology at that point just went into the series. And I think that has a lot to do with why they did a period piece with it as well. But it was also, they created, as I think Bryce put it, the grand unification of conspiracy, which is they tied together Roswell and the UFO cover-up with the JFK assassination, which, as it was to turn out, was quite prescient in its way.
Well, that seems to me like a natural association, to tell you the truth, but that's because I've been thinking about conspiracies in Roswell since I was like 12 years old. So to me, I'm like, obviously they're connected somehow, because the same people that covered up Roswell are the same people that killed JFK. But a couple of things you said there that I think are pretty interesting. Number one was that the government, when he was talking to his relative who would drive Ronald Reagan's...
Well, it was a family friend.
A family friend, okay. But would drive the cars back and forth between D.C. and California. Man, that's a lot of time to think.
It's a lot of talking, too.
But when you go down that road, that idea, though, that the frog and water effect, that we would eventually would just seep in enough that we believe it.
Accept it.
When it was presented to us, we'd just be like, okay, so no, you wouldn't have the freak out factor because it's what we expected all along.
Right.
That's what I always thought was the idea of that. If you had read Dr. Bud Hopkins' book or John, Intruders and all of these different tales from the late 80s and early 90s of alien abductions, and the idea that these women were being abducted and they were impregnated on the ship They came back, and then they would have a miscarriage or a tragedy would happen to them, and then they would have another vision or whatever that the aliens just came back and took the children back to eventually be released in society. This idea of the alien-human hybrid being created, and then they would be fed into the general population so that eventually when the aliens would show up, there's no way that we could be mean towards them or we could attack them or whatever, because there were so many of them already among us who were part of our, if your best friend is an alien human hybrid and she doesn't know it, it's going to be a lot it's going to be a lot harder to hate aliens when they finally say, "Ta-da! We're here. Sorry about the anal probes."
I mean, there's some truth to that, and I think that the way they decided to go about it, which was featuring the hive, which is the sort of ganglion creature that gets implanted in people's brains, I think is playing along on those similar ideas of that. Because
into that real quick. I want you to go into that real quick for people who may have not watched the show. It's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to pick up on, but the idea of an alien invasion, but it's not the kind of like invaders from Mars or War of the Worlds thing that we're used to. So what are the ganglions?
So it's a far more subtle form of invasion. So think more along the lines of Robert Heinlein's The Puppet Masters or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Mm-hmm. If you're inclined towards British sci-fi, Quatermass 2, Nigel Neal's serial and later the Hammer movie. So the idea is that the Greys themselves have been taken over by this sort of large insect-like creature that they call the ganglion, which is part of the hive, that's basically a hive mind thing. And what they basically are doing is abducting people. It gets into your brain and essentially it takes you over. So there's a period where people are kind of acting irrational and whatnot, say things that don't make sense. But the idea is that instead of showing up, all at once in the big mothership, a la War of the Worlds with the Martian tripods or Independence Day with the city destroyers, they're sort of here and they're abducting people and they're implanting people step by step. Everything from suburban housewives to racists in Mississippi to, congressmen up in D.C., as it turns out in the first episode. So it's a far more subtle version of invasion, but I think it is playing around with those same ideas which are in the atmosphere at the time. But once again, going back to, as Bryce told Robbie Graham, you're throwing everything you know from ufology in there. But also because they're doing a period piece for obvious reasons, even though it's already an alternate history in that respect, you can't, I guess, show up with, aliens blowing up JFK's White House, for example.
Well, a couple of things you mentioned there are two people we talk about the podcast fairly frequently. Number one, Nigel Neal, you're talking about Quatermass, which is, like classic mid-century British science fiction TV. But also, he's the guy that wrote the movie The Stone Tape.
Oh, yes.
And so that's where we get the stone tape theory, the idea that ghosts can be recordings in like the physical walls, that they may not be intelligent spirits, but a haunting is a recording, much like a record player, the grooves in vinyl. And if you want to see a great exploration of that, there's an episode of Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers where someone actually tries to recreate that. And it's from like the early 80s, but you can see it on YouTube. Like they have all that stuff on YouTube.
I have it on DVD, actually, because I have that kind of urge.
All right, perfect. So number one. And number two, Robbie Graham obviously has been on the show several times. And Silver Screen Saucers, I think, is one of the best UFO books that came out in the past 10 years because it really gets into this idea that the UFO stories that we thought in the 90s, like Dark Skies, like The X-Files, like Bob Lazar, that the reason that we weren't necessarily crazy to think that those were true, but the idea was someone really wanted us to believe that those stories were true.
Right.
That the planting of the disinformation.
Yeah. which could have happened in this case. I mean, there's a really interesting thing in the mid-90s where Rick Doty, who's the AFOSI guy who's tied in a lot with the Benowitz affair in New Mexico in the 70s and 80s, which is really the foundation for a lot of the modern UFO myth, as Mark Pilkington talks about in Mirage Men, for example.
Can you give a quick, what's the elevator paragraph on that for people who may not be up to speed?
Of course. Yes. So Paul Benowitz was a World War II veteran, government contractor, a bit of electronics genius, living near Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And in the late 70s, he started noticing strange things happening around and above the base there. And through his connections, and also being an electronics expert, he had recordings and everything else of all this. He eventually shows up at the base one day and says, "I think you have a security risk." And the AFOSI, so it's the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, goes through this whole thing with him rather than telling him, yeah, there's classified stuff going on the base. We really don't need to talk about. You're a veteran. I'm sure you understand. They took him down this whole trail of leading him to believe that there was an extraterrestrial invasion underway. There had been a secret treaty between the U.S. government and a group of aliens. The whole Dulce base, which I think anybody who's really delved into the cover-up and conspiracy side of all this is probably aware of, are all born out of these kinds of weird events going on around Kirtland Air Force Base in the late 70s, early 80s. And it ended up ensnaring a lot of people in wider ufology as well. Bill Moore, who was one of the early investigators of Roswell, co-wrote the original book on it, was apparently recruited to spy on Benowitz and feed him disinformation. He famously came out at the 1989 MUFON conference in Las Vegas, and which effectively was the end of his dealings with the UFO community. Linda Moulton Howe was
because he said that he was hired by the Department of Defense, the CIA, or Operation Intelligence. Whatever, he was hired to feed this disinformation.
He was feeding disinformation into it, and on sort of the understanding, having made a kind of Faustian bargain, that he would in turn be given real information. But at the end, he eventually decided what he was being given wasn't true either. But the whole reason I mention this is that talking about the stuff in the 90s, there's a period for a couple of years, as Greg Bishop revealed in his book about the Benowitz Affair Project Beta, where Rick Doty was acting as a consultant to the X-Files. And Doty at least claims that he put certain ideas into the X-Files in its second and third seasons, which is when it's starting to really delve into its mythology and the idea of cover-ups and disinformation.
Those were the best seasons of the X-Files, too, if I remember correctly, because the first season was... Yeah, by the time we get to the third season... you have like Mulder in space with the Indians and stuff like that. There was some weird stuff.
Yes.
But the second and third season, like where Scully gets abducted for several episodes, Krychek comes in, the whole thing, like it was the balls, if I remember correctly.
It was good stuff. I did rewatch a good chunk of the X-Files because I did, at one point in the book talk about, the Dark Skies versus X-Files comparison, which certainly critics made at the time, and basically going, is it valid or is it not? And as to answer that question, I suppose I would tell you to go read the book, but I wouldn't.
It's like, you want to know?
Naturally.
You can find out on Kindle for $4.99.
Yes.
But actually, we're gonna have links to the books. I'm not exactly sure the price on Amazon or whatever, but we have links to the books and everything like that. Othersidepodcast.com/296, so you can pick up your own copy of the Silver Archive Dark Skies and read Matthew's extensive research. We'll remind everybody about that again at the end.
Thank you. But going back to all this and talking about disinformation potentially being injected into the show, there's a really strange story. And this was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because it's an Easter egg hidden on, I think, the last disc of the DVD set. There's this fascinating story from the night the first episode went out. And Bryce and Brent, obviously, because there's two different versions of the pilot, had seen it about 100 and something times. House, Beverly Hills, cast and crews invited. There's a couple of hundred people there. TV set up around the house, and as Bryce and Brent put it, Bryce is holding the party. Brent is just kind of walking around the house, watching people's reactions to things. And at one point during one of the commercial breaks, he goes out kind of on the back porch, and this gentleman approaches him, sort of young, clean-cut, mid-late 20s, approaches him and says, "We've seen your pilot. And you've got a lot of stuff right. but we think you could get more right, and we want to help you.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, but I love, this is so meta.
Yes.
Like it's layer upon layer, and the fact that you're like, this is an Easter egg in the last disc of the DVD collection that came out 10 years ago. God bless you, Matthew Kresal. God bless
yeah, really.
But I really wanted to get to the heart of this story because it's a fascinating one, because this guy ends up having a whole conversation with Bryce and Brent, and he's revealing details of episodes they haven't shot yet or that are in the scripting phase. But the really odd detail at this point is everybody who came to the party was issued with a fake Majestic 12 badge. It was sort of modeled on Bob Lazar's
cool.
S4 badge.
Awesome.
This guy didn't have one.
Ah.
And he just kind of wandered into the party. And at one point, trying to prove how genuine he was, he borrows a napkin or a piece of paper from someone and scribbles down this weird-looking equation on the back of this thing and hands it back to Brent. And Brent asks him, well, what is this? And the guy tells him it's the secrets of the universe, sound, light, and frequency. And you'll want to hold on to this. And the guy just kind of wanders away at that point and says, we'll be in touch.
Oh, boy.
And a week or so later...
I mean, honestly, weird stuff happens in California all the time.
That guy really brings a party down, though, man.
He's like, you want to know the real deal?
The story just gets weirder.
Okay.
Because about a week or so later, there's a big meeting held at the Dark Skies production office. You know, there's a meeting that's arranged, and it's not just the guy from the party who calls himself JC, but there's another guy who he describes as his commanding officer, sort of as Bryce describes him, older, 50s, crew cut, military type, very serious-minded, down to business. And they sit down in the conference room in the production office, and these two guys spend 2 hours or so laying out this entire narrative of what's really been going on. And as Bryce put it, it didn't feel like they were trying to be terribly complimentary to them. And in times were downright insulting, going, well, you think you're so smart, you don't have this in your show, and you don't have that in your show. And at one point, the guy apparently gets out a vial of some gold-looking stuff, sort of puts it on the table and goes, for one thing, you don't have this in your show. And this is what the aliens are. This is what everything's about. And the aliens are mining this on the moon, and they've about mined it out there, and they're starting to move their operations here to Earth. And you have to redirect your entire show around this.
Wow. Whoa. Hold on. Like, first of all, that means imagine what we would have had with 5 seasons of Dark Skies, number one.
Yeah.
Right.
And number two, so this I was excited about this show because I really like the actor J.T. Walsh.
Yes.
And I thought he was a wonderful character actor that showed up in a million different genre things and a lot of and so I was like, I always liked him. So I'm like, I'll definitely check it out because I want to see what he's up to. And then Tobe Hooper's directing. I'm like, that sounds cool. But the fact is, I mean, did Chris Carter ever have somebody come into his office and say, here's what the aliens are mining on the moon? I mean, those guys must have been like, what the hell is going on? And how?
Pretty much. Bryce and Brent was basically saying the whole thing kind of weirded them out. And the two guys, these two guys who eventually identified themselves from being from naval intelligence and told them that there's sort of two arms of the U.S. military sort of wrestling over the UFO question. Mm-hmm. And there's a group of Air Force people who call the Aviary. Once again, going back to the Benowitz affair, because that was supposedly the sources that Benowitz and Moore had, was a group of Air Force people calling themselves the Aviary. But also these Navy people calling themselves the Aquarium. And eventually the two guys realized that they perhaps weren't getting through to Bryce and Brent. And there's an admiral you can meet. I can see you're not convinced, but you can meet him and we can read you more into this. He's on a ship in Long Beach at the moment, but you can't meet him on the ship. That would give everything away. So we're going to have to schedule a meeting somewhere else. Well, where do you want to have the meeting? And kid you not, because I got this straight from the horse's mouth from both Bryce and Brent. They looked them in the eye and told them a cemetery in Long Beach at midnight.
What?
And that
Too
was when
awesome.
Bryce pushed away from the table at that point, went, okay, I don't have any more time for this. I'm not meeting you or anyone else in a cemetery at midnight. I have a show to run and 3 kids. Good day. And it's just one of those stories. It's absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really wanted to do in writing the book was try to get to the heart of that story and try to, solve it. And to be honest, I'm slightly more clued in than I was when I started writing the book, but I don't have a definitive answer to it. Bryce himself told me, as I quote in the book, that it was either real or it was real disinformation. And the fact that at the same time this is going down, Rick Doty, who's a known disinformation agent, one of the Mirage men, as it were, is, pumping information into the X-Files, certainly suggests to me that there's a possibility that it was a disinformation effort. And there's certainly a long history of things like that happening. Bob Ebenegger, for example, the whole story of that, the film of the Hollow Man Landing, for example, that was suggested to him and presented to him, but he wasn't ever given, so he never got to see the whole thing. So it's a bait and switch game. And it's a very strange story. Now, the napkin, though, does still exist.
Oh, cool.
Brent still has it. It's in a safety deposit box. As to whether it'll ever see the light of day, Brent has his reasons for why that thing is still sitting in a safety deposit box 20 years later.
It's got to be something like wherever if he dies mysteriously, then the safety deposit box goes to the local authorities, even though they're probably obviously they're compromised already. But that little kind of thing, it's just it just makes it like, are these shows we watch and stuff that we think in the 90s as a stupid 20-year-old, now I'm a stupid 43-year-old, but as a stupid 20-year-old, you're watching these shows and you're thinking, yeah, this conspiracy thing, it's obviously they're hiding things from us and all that, and you don't have that idea that maybe we're being told that because the people in power want us to think that. And and the fact that the guys from Dark Skies came in there, that somebody's like, here's the vial of stuff that the aliens are mining on the moon.
Well, that story about the party crasher kind of made me think a little bit of a little Indrid Cold kind of action. Somebody coming from the outside and saying, and you said that he said, "We'll be seeing you again." Wasn't that the or "We'll see you again soon"? That was totally the Indrid Cold. We'll be seeing you again.
That's exactly what Indrid Cold said.
Yeah, so that made me think of that, and then it kind of made me think too about how Indrid Cold, he latched on to John Keel, who was a reporter, and media people, whether it's fictional or not, they're providing content to the world as he did. Right. So it's just kind of interesting thought.
I think, Wendy, that's a really good point, because I think the Mothman, when it comes to the idea that entire Mothman case might be some kind of, maybe the government's trying to cover up the fact that we were working on a jetpack or anything that could have happened, or some kind of exoskeleton or things like that people were working on. And then it just ends up that there's all these kind of Men in Black things around the Mothman.
And everything's just so bizarre. It's all like, and John Keel's trying to put all these weird bits and pieces together. Kind of reminds me of what you're talking about there, Matt, with just so much strangeness everywhere surrounding.
I mean, you can cloak a lot in disinformation and a lot of high strangeness as well. In the story as well from back during World War II, when the first jet fighter was being developed here in the United States, the pilot would go up, and whenever somebody else would come flying up next to him, he'd go put on a gorilla mask and put a cigar in his mouth. But it kept people from reporting it because it was just so bloody
too ridiculous.
Sort of the idea of bringing the laughter curtain down around it. But it also suggests the possibility as well, as I think, I can't remember if it was Bryce or Brent brought up in when I interviewed them, which is the idea of what if they were on the right track with something, and this was part of an effort to steer them in a particular direction. So it's, I sort of end up quoting Walter Lord, who wrote A Night to Remember, which is the book about the sinking of the Titanic, that at the end, nobody in their right mind is going to claim to be the final arbiter about what happened the night the Titanic sank. And I certainly don't claim to be that when it comes to this story of this, this weird strangeness going around on the Dark Sky set. But it's just a story. There's possibilities there. There's definite probabilities even, but whether there's a definitive answer to it or not is a whole different matter.
But it also turns the shows that we were watching in the 90s that we thought we were just fiction, and harmless fiction at the time.
Yeah.
Like the thing is the guys from Dark Skies might have been like, okay, I don't want any part of this because whatever you're selling, we're not interested. But what if the government disinformation agents are the ones responsible for Baywatch Nights? What if Hasselhoff was like, I'm in, whatever you need. I got you. Like the idea that they compromised the Hoff really changes my childhood in a way that I'm not comfortable with. But that entire idea, the idea that what we're watching on TV. So sometimes you may get the idea, especially when it was things around the invasion of Iraq or things that later, like we thought there was going to be weapons, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the New York Times is like, yep, there's weapons. And then we find out, okay, they were fed something, and then they propagated it, and then there was popular support for an invasion. You think that, okay, so sometimes the media is manipulated by press releases or government informants or things like that, but you don't often think that fiction is just as manipulated. So this idea that in the 90s they had a disinformation agent on the X-Files, they're sending guys, or maybe it's true, maybe the aliens are mining something mining the liquid on the moon. That whole idea is that we have to not only question all the things that we see in the news, but not all the things we see in fiction, in that it might be trying to guide us towards a certain kind of idea that is manipulated. And the fact that these guys are so free in talking about it, I find particularly fascinating. Because it's 20 some years on, they had a show that they might have had 19 good episodes, but they never got to realize the fruition of their, and that is the danger of American television, that you can never, almost never tell a complete story unless it's a hit.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of one of those things, because they had the 5-year plan, and it was very much done in that kind of serial format, and that every episode builds on something in a previous episode. It was in the ways it was ahead of its time in that regard, though you do have things like Twin Peaks and the X-Files, which are building that in slowly. But I think Dark Skies is notable for
J. Michael Straczynski was the first guy I can think of with the 5-year plan, right?
Yeah. I always forget about Babylon 5. Don't ask me why. But it was kind of one of those first times they had done, sort of times it was done on American, sort of at least network television, they were going to do it.
And a big budget.
And a big budget. And I think that was part of what doomed the show, as was the fact that it was on an early Saturday slot. It was part of the NBC trilogy. So it was Dark Skies, The Pretender, and The Profiler. And it was also probably not in Dark Sky's favor that it wasn't wholly owned by NBC, whereas the other two shows were at least partly owned. So I think NBC was less invested in the show than it was in the other two, because the other two had pretty long runs. I mean, they went on for, I think, 3 or 5 seasons apiece.
Also, when you think about that real quick, this is a very other 90s thing. When you're saying the trilogy on Saturday nights. Okay, so Dark Skies comes out with the alien stuff, but then Pretender and Profiler, particularly Profiler, and I don't know if you guys remember the first season of the X-Files, but I feel like the first season of the X-Files was extraordinarily influenced by the Silence of the Lambs. I feel like Scully's character was very Clarice Starling, so much so that I remember the first few episodes that I was, no, that was 17. No, yep, 17 when it came. And so I remember thinking like, man, this is just going to be a Silence of the Lambs kind of rip in some different episodes. So it's an interesting thing you put that, because we're taking different aspects of 90s culture and what was guiding the culture at the time. This fascination with serial killers, fascination with aliens, ghosts and demons and all those kind of things that are kind of in the forefront now. At that time, they were the back burner towards a less supernatural type of enemy and a more explainable type of enemy, because aliens are flesh and blood, and they might have advanced technology that's indistinguishable from magic. Thank you, Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah.
And serial killers might be crazy as monsters or whatever, but they still are within the realm of human possibility, whereas when you talk about supernatural stuff, that is something that is fundamentally unexplainable.
Right. And I have to say, just in my own reading of things, I tend to be a nuts and bolts kind of person.
Sure.
What evidence can you bring me and sort of do that? I do think, sort of at the end of the 3-year journey I spent doing, somebody with a lifelong interest in the topic, anyways, but really 3 years of dedicated reading and research to going into the book. At the end of that journey, I'm less convinced of, there's no one explanation to this whole phenomenon, as I'm sure other people have said on the show before, people who are a lot smarter than I am. There's no one explanation to this whole phenomenon. And I do also think at the end of this journey that, maybe the U.S. government doesn't know as much as we sometimes have thought that it did. And I think that there has been a perception that's sort of been created that, of sort of the all-powerful entity within government who knows all the answers to these questions.
The smoking man.
Yeah, the smoking man, the whole idea that one day the President of the United States, disclosure with the big D, the President of the United States is going to stand up one day and give a big press conference and say, they're here, they're real, and they've been here since the late 40s.
Right. Don't you think Trump would have let that one out yet? Like, he would have been like, aliens.
Yeah, he'd be like, this is mine to tweet about.
This is huge.
Yes. Fun story there. As part of in the middle of all this, I also write fiction. So I've gone through what one of my writing buddies calls a flying saucer phase. So I've had 2 or 3 things published, which are all UFO related. Awesome. And cool. One of which is in an anthology published out of Canada called Trump, Utopia, or Dystopia. And I have a story in there called Credibility Gap, which is based around the whole premise of the Majestic 12 deciding to announce aliens are real and not counting on the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States.
Uh-oh. That sounds fun.
And let's go back, though, because the Majestic 12 is a huge part of Dark Skies. And that was one of the things that excited me about it. I remember, because the idea that they finally brought the Majestic 12 in there. And even in ufology, I mean, everything is in ufology, they're fighting each other. You know what I mean? So, and I remember, Nick Redfern telling me, he's like, the Majestic 12, I think it's bullshit, mate. That whole idea. And then Stanton Freeman, he's standing behind, he's standing behind the Majestic 12. And you get that. And the Majestic 12 ends up being a major player in Dark Skies. So, what's a little bit of the real Majestic 12? And then what's the Dark Skies version, real quick?
What's sort of the real Majestic 12 in inverted commas is that certainly the idea that there's this government agency that's being run by these 12 people who are high up in, politics and government and military, who are essentially running the whole UFO cover-up. It was sort of established by Truman as a result of Roswell to do that. What's fictional in Dark Skies is the idea that they are the frontline fighters of this secretive alien invasion. And by the time the show starts in 61, they've been dealing with this for a decade and a half at that point. So the show actually opens, I take that back, in May 1960 with Francis Gary Powers, his U-2 spy plane getting shot down over Russia. Was flying the U-2 from Majestic chasing a hive saucer over Russian airspace and ends up getting knocked out of the skies by a hive saucer. What's interesting about that is that, at least in the broadcast version here in the U.S., one of the members of the Majestic 12 who shows up, who's not in the original documents but is a creation for the show, is Alan Dulles, who's the head of the CIA in this period, from 53 to 61, so under Eisenhower and the early Kennedy administration.
And then in the airport after.
And Dulles actually... Yes.
Nice.
Actually, I think the airport may be named after his brother, because his brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State. So it's this really weird thing in the 50s in American government where the overt and covert sides of American foreign policy were being run by the same set of brothers. One over at the State Department and one over at the CIA.
Let's stop for a second. Did you? Okay, I did not. Of course, John Foster Dulles. Okay, so State Department run by Dulles, and then the CIA run by Dulles. The Justice Department, run by Robert Kennedy. The presidency, John F. Kennedy.
Yeah,
everybody was cool with this? Like all these families?
It doesn't become a federal law till, I think, after JFK is assassinated, about appointing members of your family to government, essentially.
Well, obviously that's not the way it is now.
Major government departments. You can appoint them to cabinet-level positions, but you can certainly appoint them to advisory roles in the White House, as anybody who's turned on the news in the last 3 years probably knows. But certainly the Majestic 12 of Dark Skies fits the sort of secretive, maybe slightly malevolent government agency trope. It's run by J.T. Walsh as Captain Frank Bach, who's this Navy officer who gets drawn into things at Roswell and who essentially will run the agency for the next couple of decades. But there's a lot of real people who are on the Majestic 12 board in the show. Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford.
Lizard person.
Yeah.
Just what I heard.
Who else? Yes. Hubert Humphrey, who's a senator from Minnesota, if memory serves, later becomes vice president under Johnson. There's a whole list of people who end up being involved with it. Though he's not on the Majestic 12 board, in the last couple episodes of the series, Carl Sagan gets drawn in as a scientific advisor to Majestic.
And that's one of the fun things about this show that I thought was, like, the way they fictionize people. Like, they bring the Beatles in. They bring the Kennedys in. But then they bring in Carl Sagan. And you're like, all right. You're like, and I know that Carl Sagan... in our paranormal community, people hate him because of the Demon Haunted World book. But personally, I've read that, I feel that Carl Sagan, if you could make him believe in something, like that's the kind of test we have to have for paranormal activity. These are the kind of people we have to convince in order to eventually get some credibility for it. And so the fact that they brought Carl Sagan in was awesome.
Yeah. The funny thing about Sagan is that he started out as a UFO believer. William Poundstone, who in the late 90s wrote a biography of Sagan called The Life in the Cosmos, was able to find through interviewing his roommate, for example, at the University of Chicago, would drag him up to the roof to go UFO hunting. And even in 1952, he writes to the then Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, asking why is the State Department not taking this subject seriously? Sagan was taking the UFO topic seriously into the early 1960s. He writes a NASA-funded paper, which essentially promotes the idea of what we would today recognize as the ancient astronaut, ancient aliens idea, to the point of, even relativistic space travel. There's a strong possibility that at least sometime in recorded history, aliens have showed up on Earth. And even go so far as to say that there are myths and legends that could be consulted that might offer evidence of this. And that's in 1962. And it's not but 4 years after that Sagan suddenly seems to throw a switch on the UFO topic.
Oh, they got to him.
And that is the implication in the show. And certainly Bryce has said that because at one point Bryce worked for CNN, and in 1981 CNN did a special with Sagan as one of the Voyager probes was doing its flyby of Saturn. And as Bryce tells it, originally in his book, he co-wrote with Richard Dolan, AD After Disclosure, and which I get to go into in my book. Him and Sagan kind of had a 15, 20-minute conversation. And whatnot. And I think certainly Bryce's point of view on it is that, somebody like Sagan might have made the same kind of Faustian bargain that, you can come in and you can learn everything, but you're not going to be able to tell anybody. But you can work on it, but you can't tell anybody what you found out. Are you willing to do that? And that Sagan, as a young, ambitious scientist, could very well have made that kind of a deal. And certainly Sagan worked on classified projects, as we now know. He was involved with an Air Force project that's become quite famous called A119, which was the idea of nuking the moon in effect. And Sagan worked on that, and for many years had a security clearance with both the Air Force and NASA.
Why would we nuke the? Why would we nuke the moon? Like, I mean,
well, This was an early Cold War idea about showing the superiority of American rocketry and nuclear weapons. The Air Force got the bright idea that they would hurl massive nuclear weapons at the moon, and that the explosion and resulting crater would be seen from Earth. It was clearly a cockamamie idea, and it never went ahead. But this was one of the many things that Sagan worked on. And as I said, his paper for NASA, which is essentially promoting the ancient astronaut idea, years before Eric von Däniken is putting it out to the public in Chariots of the Gods.
I was going to say, so that is like 1962 or whatever. Chariots of the Gods is still another 8 years away.
69, for the first English edition of it. So there's, it's interesting that Sagan kind of had that switch. And famously in Cosmos, I think it's the penultimate episode of Cosmos in 1980, debunking the Betty and Barney Hill star map, for example. So it's interesting that Sagan, started out as somebody who was very interested in the topic, and then seems to have just thrown a switch somewhere in the early mid-'60s to suddenly being very outspoken against the topic. But how much of that is down to, was he somebody like Howard Menzel, for example, going back to the, what we think we know from the Majestic 12 documents, famous Harvard astronomer who, is alleged to have been in on the cover-up from almost the beginning. So it comes back to the question of how much reality is there? What's the actual truth here? And does that mean that we need to go back and look at the historical record in a different way?
It's funny you mentioned,
guys suggest.
You mentioned Howard Menzel. Because I was thinking about this about Avi Loeb. And he's the guy that, remember the Yama Yama? Remember the thing that was coming through last year? There was that big space pancake that was coming through, and everybody's like, well, it's just a weird space thing. And he's like, well, it might be an alien ship. And it's this Harvard astronomer that keeps out, it's like, it's, let's just remember it might be an alien ship. Yeah. And every time there is some kind of weird anomaly out there, he's the one that seems to think like, you know what? It might be something of extraterrestrial origin or extraterrestrial intelligence. And it's almost funny to me that he's always the guy that shows up and says it. Because, and the way you were talking about, somebody, a Harvard astronomer who's in on it. Well, and you always think, you always read like, okay, well, he's the astronomer that's on our side. He's Avi Loeb. He's the astronomer that's on the side of the truth and figuring it out. And, I remember when Wendy and I met Richard Dolan at the, it was Minnesota, Wendy. We were there 4 years ago this month.
The Paradigm Symposium.
Yeah, the Paradigm Symposium. I mean, Richard Dolan, he had a great presentation, and he's a brilliant guy, super great speaker, funny, all those kind of things. But what he was saying, I mean, his entire presentation was basically the X-Files are real. It was just a very straight up classic, 90s style, here's what the government is telling you. And this idea, this idea that the things that we think are subversive, like, oh, Avi Loeb is so subversive because he's the guy that thinks that aliens are real. The idea that he might be on the payroll, it breaks my heart a little. But I also find it believable. We do have a quick question from one of our Patreons, quick. And Bart, he liked Dark Skies, but he's also wondering about the show Millennium in the same kind of genre. And Millennium is related to the X-Files, same creator, Chris Carter. And
Yep.
Just, is the idea, was there anything in, did you ever hear any stories that Chris Carter or Lance Henriksen was approached any kind of disinformation stuff about Millennium, or hear anything about that show?
No, I haven't heard anything about Millennium. As I said, I did learn about Rick Doty being involved with the X-Files at one point, but I never came across anything with Millennium. I will say that if you're asking, since he asked about Millennium, there is an upcoming book in the Silver Archive written by my good friend Robert Smith, which will be covering the second season of that show in detail. So you may want to check that out when it comes out. I think it'll be sometime early next year.
And the second season,
certainly
the second season of Millennium was some dark shit. That was it definitely was non-traditional television in the second season, which is why they completely revamped it for the third season.
Yeah.
Just shooting that out there. I was a Millennium super fan.
I just like that the main character's name is Frank Black.
Right, like from the Pixies.
Right. Like, when's he going to bust out the guitar and start rocking?
Right. I tell you what, Matthew, we're running out of time here, but I have to say, this has been a complete pleasure, and I didn't even get to, I would say, 75% of my questions. So we're going to have to do a follow-up with you and talk a little bit more about Dark Skies and everything. And also, for anybody who's watching this later on or listening to it later on, please check out our website, othersidepodcast.com. And if you have questions for Matthew or anything like that, we can try to answer them, or Twitter at Otherside Podcast, Twitter at Otherside Talk, and we can discuss more about it there. But the thing is, Silver Archive, Dark Skies, if you are a fan of this show, it's a book you're going to want to check out.
Yes.
Because it really sounds like there's so much more than just the usual Hollywood kind of thing. There is real UFO lore baked into the actual UFO lore of the show.
Yes.
And is the show available for people to watch? Like, do you have to buy the DVD set, or is it available anywhere streaming?
It's not streaming anywhere at the moment. I know that Bryce and Brent have both said that they're hoping that eventually, because the show's owned by Sony and is trying, they've been gently, nudging Sony, trying to get it out there. The Shout Factory DVD set from 2011 is still available. I highly recommend it. I think of my book as a companion to the DVD set, because there's a lot of great special features and stuff on there as well. So I very much view my book as, the companion to it. I have to say, when I was interviewing Bryce, he did say something that was both immensely flattering but also slightly terrifying to me, which is that, he said, your book may be the only one that's ever written about the show, so we want it to be good. And it's like, I don't know whether to be flattered or terrified.
Well,
right, now you're part of the story, Matt.
Yeah.
No pressure, but we're all counting on you. Like, when you think of the millions of dollars that were spent and the thousands of hours that were put in by people that are dead now, like by Tobe Hooper, J.T. Walsh, and the whole thing. No pressure for you. But either way, I encourage everybody to check out this book, because it is a fascinating topic, and there's a lot more to this show than just the usual celebrity dirt. There is paranormal stuff behind it. And so, Matt, is there any kind of particular place where people can find you on the web or follow you if they're interested in your writing or your podcasting, your talking, any place that you want to share?
You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Matthew Kresal, I think is the easiest way to find me. I am going to be setting up a Twitter here shortly, because I've been encouraged by just about all of my writer friends to finally get on there. So I'll be on Twitter shortly. I don't know what my handle is going to be yet. I imagine it may be something along the line of Kresal Writes, if that hasn't been taken. So I'll send you a link, and you can put it in the show notes if all else fails.
Fantastic.
Sounds great.
And you guys can find those show notes at othersidepodcast.com/296. Hey, everybody who's watching us live on YouTube, thank you very much. If you're watching this in the future, hello from the past.
And thank you very much.
Hello.
But either way, everybody, have a great week. Good luck to you, and we will see you on the other side.